March 12th, 1945. Fort Devens, Massachusetts. 14:30 hours. The interrogation room smelled of old wood, cigarette smoke, and the peculiar mustiness that inhabited all military buildings constructed in haste. Hauptmann Klaus Richter sat at a plain wooden table, his Wehrmacht uniform still bearing the dust of North Africa despite 3 weeks in American custody. Across from him, Lieutenant David Hoffman of the U.S. Army Intelligence Service arranged a stack of documents with methodical precision. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the bare walls. Through the window, Richter could see American soldiers playing volleyball in the spring sunshine, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. He found himself staring at them, these enemies who did not seem like enemies at all, these soldiers who played games as if the war were some distant abstraction, rather than the all-consuming reality that had defined his existence for 5 years. Lieutenant Hoffman noticed the direction of Richter's gaze and smiled slightly. "They have the afternoon off," he said, in flawless German, his accent suggesting Vienna or perhaps Prague. Recreation is considered essential to morale and combat effectiveness. The army mandates regular leisure time. Richter turned back to face his interrogator, studying the man's expression for mockery or propaganda. He found neither. Hoffman was simply stating a fact, describing a system so alien to Richter's experience that it might as well have been science fiction. In the Wehrmacht, free time was a luxury granted sparingly, leisure was weakness, and the entire apparatus of military life was designed around discipline, hierarchy, and the subordination of individual comfort to collective purpose. Richter had been an interrogator himself before his capture. For 3 years he had questioned Allied prisoners, British, American, French, Polish, extracting tactical information, assessing morale, compiling intelligence reports for headquarters. He had been good at his work, praised by superiors for his psychological insight and his ability to identify when prisoners were lying or withholding information. He understood interrogation as a game of leverage and psychology, finding pressure points, exploiting fears, offering false promises of leniency or threatening consequences for non-cooperation. The Americans, he was discovering, played an entirely different game with entirely different rules, and the discovery was profoundly unsettling. This was not his first interrogation session. Over the previous 3 weeks he had been questioned multiple times by various intelligence officers, each session following the same bewildering pattern. The Americans were polite, almost conversational. They offered cigarettes, coffee, even chocolate. They asked questions but did not press when he declined to answer. They treated him with a professional courtesy that bordered on friendliness. There was no coercion, no threats, no physical intimidation. The Geneva Convention protections he had expected to be theoretical were, in practice, scrupulously observed. This itself was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any brutality could have been, because it undermined every assumption about American weakness and decadence that had sustained him through years of war. Hoffman pushed a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes across the table. Smoke, Richter accepted, noting the casual generosity with which the American offered luxuries that would have been treasured commodities in Germany. Hoffman lit both cigarettes with a silver lighter, then leaned back in his chair, studying Richter with the calm assessment of a physician examining a patient. "I've reviewed your file," he said. "Wehrmacht intelligence attached to the Afrika Korps, captured near Tunis in May 1943. You've been through the camp system, first in North Africa, then England, now here. You've seen quite a bit of our operations. I'm curious about your impressions." It was not phrased as a question, and Richter understood that Hoffman was not seeking tactical intelligence. This was something else, an assessment of propaganda effectiveness, perhaps, or psychological research, or simply genuine curiosity. The ambiguity itself was characteristic of American methods, which seemed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, every action serving several purposes. Richter drew on his cigarette, considering his response. He had maintained strict silence during earlier interrogations, offering only name, rank, and serial number as regulations required. But 3 weeks of observation had cracked something fundamental in his understanding of the war, of his nation's ideology, of the narrative that had sustained him. He was tired of silence, tired of pretending that the evidence of his eyes was propaganda, tired of maintaining beliefs that observation had systematically demolished. "It's unreal," he said finally. the word escaping before he could reconsider. Everything here, the abundance, the waste, the casualness, the way you treat prisoners, the food, the facilities, the rules you actually follow, it's all unreal, like a stage set designed to convince us of something that cannot possibly be authentic. Hoffmann nodded slowly as if this response confirmed something he had expected. And yet it is authentic. What you see is not exceptional. It's standard. Every POW camp in the United States operates under the same protocols. Every military installation provides similar amenities. This is not propaganda designed for your consumption. This is simply how we function. That was precisely what made it unreal, Richter thought. Not that it was false, but that it was true. Not that it was deception, but that it was genuine. The impossibility was not in the individual elements, the abundant food, the medical care, the recreation facilities, the adherence to international law, but in the system that could produce and sustain these things while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple continents. Germany had mobilized its entire economy, stripped its civilian population, extracted resources from occupied territories, and still struggled to adequately supply its military forces. The Americans seemed to be operating with surplus, with excess capacity, with resources so abundant that they could afford generosity toward captured enemies. Hauptmann Klaus Richter's journey to that interrogation room in Massachusetts had begun more than 2 years earlier, in the deserts of North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps fought an increasingly desperate campaign against British and American forces. Richter had volunteered for North Africa in early 1942, drawn by the mystique of the Desert War, the reputation of Rommel, and the belief that Africa represented the key to controlling the Mediterranean and ultimately defeating Britain. He had been trained in intelligence work at the Abwehr School in Hamburg, where instructors emphasized the weakness of democratic societies, their lack of discipline, their inability to sustain prolonged conflict, their vulnerability to propaganda and demoralization. The instructors had been particularly emphatic about Americans. They were soft, corrupted by material comfort and individualism. Their army was poorly trained, their soldiers unmotivated, their society fractured by racial and class divisions. They were good at industrial production, but lacked the warrior spirit necessary for real combat. They would break when confronted by dedicated, disciplined German forces. Richter had believed this because everyone believed it, because the entire apparatus of education and propaganda reinforced it, because alternative explanations were literally unthinkable within the framework of Nazi ideology. The North African campaign had begun to crack these certainties. The American forces that landed in Operation Torch in November 1942 were initially inexperienced and suffered from coordination problems, but they learned with disturbing speed. More significantly, they never seemed to run out of anything. German forces struggled with fuel shortages, ammunition rationing, inadequate supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean and constantly harassed by Allied air and naval power. The Americans had everything: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, vehicles. When something broke, they replaced it. When supplies ran low, convoys brought more. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention. Richter had interrogated his first American prisoner in January 1943, a young lieutenant from the 1st Armoured Division captured during fighting near Kasserine Pass. The American had been wounded in the leg, and Richter had been struck by the quality of medical treatment he had received before capture. His own medics had bandaged the wound with supplies clearly superior to what German forces carried. The prisoner was nervous but not terrified, following his training to provide only basic identification. What struck Richter most was the man's confusion about why he was fighting. He believed in the war's necessity, stopping Hitler, defending freedom, but in abstract terms, as if these were principles he had been taught rather than passions he felt. There was no ideology in the German sense, no mystical connection to nation or leader, just a practical commitment to completing an unpleasant but necessary job. "Why are you here?" Richter had asked. "Why did America enter this war?" The lieutenant had thought about this, struggling to articulate something he had never needed to explain. "Because you attacked our allies," he said finally. "Because Hitler's taking over Europe. Because what Germany's doing is wrong. Because if we don't stop it now, we'll have to stop it later when it's harder." The answer had been unsatisfying in its simplicity, its lack of grand rhetoric or ideological fervour. But over subsequent months, as Richter interrogated dozens more American prisoners, he heard variations of the same theme. They were fighting because their country was at war, because their leaders had decided intervention was necessary, because the alternative seemed worse. There was no cult of the leader, no worship of the state, no belief in racial superiority or historical destiny. They were overwhelmingly citizens who had become soldiers temporarily, and expected to return to civilian life when the war ended. The concept itself was alien to German military culture, which emphasized the soldier as a distinct caste, a warrior elite separated from and superior to civilian society. The material abundance was even more disturbing than the ideological differences. American prisoners carried equipment that seemed almost profligate: multiple uniforms, good boots, personal items, toiletries, cigarettes, candy. When Richter's unit captured an American supply depot in February 1943, the sheer quantity of materials was staggering. Food in variety and abundance that German soldiers had not seen in years. Medical supplies in quantities that seemed wasteful. Spare parts for vehicles carefully catalogued and stored. The Americans, it appeared, had systematized abundance, created logistics that could deliver overwhelming material superiority to the point of combat. By May 1943, when the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia, Richter had begun to understand that Germany was fighting an unwinnable war. Not because German soldiers were inferior, they were not. Not because German tactics were flawed, they often achieved tactical successes, but because the material disparity was simply insurmountable. Germany could not produce fast enough, supply efficiently enough, or sustain operations across multiple theatres while facing enemies with combined industrial capacity that exceeded German capabilities by orders of magnitude. The war had become mathematical, and the mathematics were pitiless. Capture itself had been almost anticlimactic. Richter's unit, out of fuel and ammunition, had surrendered to British forces on May 12, 1943. The prisoners were processed, documented, and transported to temporary camps in North Africa before being shipped to Britain. The treatment was correct, bureaucratic, notably absent of the brutality that German propaganda insisted awaited prisoners. The British were weary and sometimes bitter. They had been fighting longer than the Americans, had endured the Blitz, had suffered heavy casualties, but they followed the rules. Food was adequate, medical care was provided, male privileges were granted. The system worked with mechanical efficiency, processing thousands of prisoners while maintaining standards that German forces rarely extended to their own captives. The transfer to the United States in late 1944 had been surreal. Richter and several hundred other German POWs were loaded onto a transport ship and sent across the Atlantic, a journey that would have been suicidal going the other direction given Allied naval dominance. The voyage took 2 weeks, and the prisoners were housed in holds that were crowded but adequate, fed regularly, and allowed on deck for fresh air and exercise. The contrast with how Germany transported prisoners, when it bothered to transport them at all rather than simply shooting them, particularly on the Eastern Front, was not lost on Richter or his fellow captives. Arrival in America had been the moment when unreality became overwhelming. The ship docked in New York Harbor, and the prisoners were marched onto American soil, processed through immigration facilities with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that greeted everyone entering the country. Through the windows of the transport trucks that moved them to the train station, Richter glimpsed the New York skyline, the impossible vertical city, the evidence of wealth and industrial capacity that made German propaganda claims about American weakness seem like pathetic fantasy. The buildings themselves were arguments, physical proof of organizational capacity and economic power. The train journey to the POW camp had taken them through landscapes that seemed impossibly abundant. Farmland stretching to the horizon, apparently untouched by war. Towns and cities with lights blazing, no blackouts, no visible damage. Factories with smokestacks pumping output, producing the materials that sustained not just American forces, but British, Soviet, and Free French armies as well. This was the arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised, and it was real, tangible, undeniable. Germany had mobilized everything, and was still losing. America had mobilized a fraction of its capacity and was winning. The POW camp at Fort Devens was not luxurious, but by German standards it was almost comfortable. The barracks were weatherproof, heated in winter, equipped with electric lighting. Prisoners received 3 meals daily, Simple but nutritious, more food than many German civilians saw. Medical facilities were staffed and supplied. There was a canteen where prisoners could purchase items with scrip earned through labour. Recreation facilities included sports equipment, books, even musical instruments. The contrast with camps that Germany operated, particularly in the East, where millions of Soviet POWs died from deliberate starvation, exposure and execution, was morally staggering. But it was not the physical comfort that most disturbed Richter. It was the system's casual certainty, its unthinking assumption that certain standards would be maintained even for enemies. The Americans did not treat prisoners well because they were soft or naive. They treated prisoners well because their system demanded it, because laws existed and were followed, because bureaucracy functioned and administrators took their responsibilities seriously, because the entire society operated on the premise that rules applied universally, even when inconvenient. This was not weakness. This was a form of strength that German ideology had not anticipated and could not comprehend. The strength of systems that function predictably, of institutions that maintain standards, of societies that treat law as binding rather than merely instrumental. Richter had been assigned to work details, agricultural labour mostly, helping with harvests in the surrounding Massachusetts farms. The work was supervised but not brutal, the hours reasonable, the conditions safe. Prisoners were paid nominal wages in camp scrip, could purchase items from the canteen, could send and receive mail, could attend religious services. The routine was monotonous but stable, and stability itself was luxury after years of war. He watched American society function around him, farmers working their land, businesses operating, schools teaching children, newspapers publishing diverse and often critical opinions, all the machinery of civil society continuing despite the massive military effort overseas. The interrogations had begun shortly after his arrival. American intelligence was systematically interviewing German POWs, gathering tactical information, assessing morale, compiling detailed reports on Wehrmacht organization and capabilities. Richter's background in intelligence work made him a prisoner of particular interest, and he was questioned multiple times by different officers. He maintained silence initially, but the questions themselves were revealing. The Americans knew more than they should have. Detailed organizational charts, technical specifications of weapons, operational doctrines. They were not fishing for information blindly. They were confirming details, filling gaps, building comprehensive understanding of their enemy. The thoroughness was characteristic of everything American, systematic, organized, relentless. Lieutenant Hoffmann's question hung in the air between them. Richter drew on his cigarette, organizing, thoughts he had been suppressing for months. We were told that Americans were soft, he said finally, that democracy made societies weak, that your individualism prevented real discipline, that you couldn't sustain a long war because your people lacked commitment. Everything I've seen contradicts this. The abundance isn't weakness, it's overwhelming strength. The adherence to law isn't naivety, it's system stability that allows you to function efficiently. The individualism doesn't prevent discipline, it creates motivated soldiers who understand why they're fighting. Hoffmann listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. Richter continued, the words coming faster now, months of suppressed observations pouring out. Your system is designed to function automatically. Orders don't require perfect obedience because the structure itself channels behavior. Soldiers don't need ideological motivation because material conditions are adequate and the cause is presented rationally. Prisoners are treated well not from sentiment but because law requires it, and institutions enforce compliance. Everything works because the system is designed to work regardless of individual virtue or dedication. You've mechanized efficiency itself, he paused, stubbing out his cigarette. In Germany, everything depends on will, the will of the leader, the will of the people, the will to power. We were taught that will could overcome material disadvantages, that spirit was superior to matter, that dedication could defeat resources. But will is exhaustible, systems are not. Your system doesn't require exceptional leaders or constant motivation. It just functions, producing abundance, enforcing standards, grinding forward regardless of setbacks. That's what we didn't understand. That's what makes it unreal from our perspective. We built everything on human will. You built everything on mechanical process. Process wins. Hoffmann nodded slowly, as if Richter had confirmed something he suspected. "How many other prisoners share your assessment?" Richter laughed bitterly. "Most, though few would articulate it. We discuss it in the barracks, late at night, trying to make sense of what we're seeing. The food is the clearest symbol. Every meal, there's more food than we can eat. Not occasionally, every meal. And you throw away the excess. You actually discard food because you have too much. For soldiers who've spent years on reduced rations, who've watched Germany strip occupied territories to feed the army, who've seen civilians starving while the military took priority, the casual waste is more disturbing than any propaganda could be." The food had indeed become symbolic. In the camp mess hall, 3 times daily, prisoners received meals that were simple but substantial. Breakfast might be oatmeal, eggs, bread, coffee, fruit. Lunch was soup, sandwiches, vegetables. Dinner included meat, potatoes, more vegetables, dessert. The portions were generous, and seconds were available. Americans complained about the monotony of military food, but to German prisoners who had been on increasingly reduced rations since 1942, the abundance was shocking, and the waste, the American habit of discarding uneaten portions, of throwing away bread because it was slightly stale, of treating food as so abundant that conservation was unnecessary. This struck at fundamental assumptions about scarcity and survival. Richter remembered a particular incident from his first week in the camp. An American guard, noticing that Richter had eaten everything on his tray with unusual thoroughness, had smiled and said, "Hungry? There's always more in the kitchen. We don't ration here." The casual comment had pierced deeper than any propaganda could have. We don't ration here. America was fighting a global war, supplying multiple allies, feeding millions of soldiers overseas, and they didn't ration food in POW camps. The implications were staggering. German prisoners compared experiences constantly, trying to construct explanations. Those who had been captured on the Eastern Front reported similar patterns. Soviet treatment was harsh initially, but improved over time, though never approaching Western standards. Those captured in Italy or France reported generous treatment by American forces even at the front lines. Medics treating captured enemies alongside their own wounded, food shared with prisoners, cigarettes offered freely. The pattern was consistent. American abundance extended even to enemies, because the abundance was so vast that sharing cost nothing. The comparison with how Germany treated prisoners was increasingly uncomfortable. Word filtered into the camps about conditions in German POW facilities, particularly in the East. Soviet prisoners died in massive numbers. Of approximately 3 million Red Army soldiers captured by Germany, roughly 2 million died in captivity from starvation, disease, exposure, or execution. This was not accident, but policy. Deliberate genocide through neglect and cruelty. Even Western prisoners, who fared better, faced harsh conditions that deteriorated as Germany's situation worsened. The contrast made clear that treatment of prisoners reflected not just military policy, but fundamental national character and system capacity. Hauptmann pulled out another document from his stack. "I want to read you something," he said. "This is from a German POW, not you, someone else, interviewed last month. He said, 'Everything we were taught about America was backwards. We thought abundance made them weak. But abundance is what makes them strong. A nation that can afford to feed its prisoners is a nation that can afford to win the war." Hauptmann looked up. "Do you agree with that assessment?" Richter considered carefully. "Yes and no. The abundance is real, but it's not just about resources. It's about the system that produces and distributes those resources. The Soviet Union has vast resources but struggles to effectively utilize them. Germany has fewer resources but initially used them efficiently through organizational discipline. America has both vast resources and efficient systems. That combination is decisive. But more than that, your system builds loyalty through material satisfaction rather than ideological indoctrination. Soldiers fight because they're well-treated, well-equipped, well-fed. That's more sustainable than ideology, because material needs are universal, while ideological commitment requires constant reinforcement." This insight had come gradually through observation and conversation. American guards at the camp were professional but rarely enthusiastic. They did their jobs competently without dramatic displays of patriotism or ideology. They complained about military life, talked about what they'd do after the war, groused about officers and regulations. This casual irreverence toward authority would have been dangerous in the Wehrmacht, where discipline was harsh and dissent was treason. But the American system didn't seem to require ideological enthusiasm. It required only functional competence, and it achieved that through adequate pay, reasonable conditions, clear regulations, and the promise of return to civilian life. The promise of civilian life was itself significant. German propaganda emphasized the soldier as permanent identity, the warrior as superior to the civilian, military life as the highest form of existence. American culture viewed military service as temporary duty, an interruption of normal life that one endured and then left behind. This created different relationships to authority and different motivations for compliance. Germans obeyed because obedience was virtue and disobedience was betrayal. Americans complied because the system made compliance easier than resistance and because they believed compliance would eventually end. Over subsequent weeks, Hauptmann continued the interviews, and Richter found himself increasingly willing to discuss his observations. These were not traditional interrogations seeking tactical intelligence. They were anthropological studies, attempts to understand how German soldiers perceived American society, and whether that perception had propaganda value. Richter understood he was being used, that his insights would be compiled into reports and possibly used for psychological warfare, but he no longer cared. The truth was more important than loyalty to a cause he now recognized as evil and doomed. He began to articulate thoughts he'd been suppressing, that the war was lost and had been lost since America entered, that German leadership knew this but continued fighting from ideological rigidity or fear of consequences, that the suffering being inflicted and endured was pointless, serving no purpose except delaying inevitable defeat, that the Nazi ideology he had been taught was not just wrong, but fundamentally incoherent, a fantasy of racial superiority contradicted by material reality, that Germany had chosen barbarism and was reaping the consequences. These were dangerous thoughts, even in captivity. Among the POWs were dedicated Nazis who maintained ideological discipline, threatened prisoners who expressed defeatism, and organized themselves into hierarchical structures that enforced continued obedience to Hitler even in American camps. Richter learned to keep his observations private, shared only with trusted friends or with American interrogators who documented everything. The camp authorities eventually separated prisoners, isolating hardcore Nazis from those considered anti-Nazi or simply weary of the war. This too was characteristic of American thoroughness. They didn't just house prisoners, they managed them according to psychological profiles and security assessments. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Richter learned of Germany's surrender from American newspapers distributed in the camp, reading accounts of the final collapse, the discovery of concentration camps, the suicide of Hitler, the complete devastation of German cities. The reports about concentration camps were initially dismissed by many prisoners as propaganda. Surely Germany had not done such things. Surely the scale was exaggerated. Surely there were explanations. But the evidence was overwhelming, the photographs undeniable, the testimony of survivors impossible to dismiss. Richter felt the foundations of his understanding crack and crumble. He had served a regime that had industrialized genocide, that had created factories for murder, that had made evil systematic and bureaucratic. The psychological impact on German POWs varied. Some maintained denial, insisting the reports were fabricated. Some collapsed into depression and guilt. Some, like Richter, experienced a strange clarity, the confirmation that their growing doubts had been justified, that the system they had served was not merely authoritarian but fundamentally evil. The conversations in the barracks became tortured, prisoners grappling with questions of responsibility, complicity, guilt. How much had they known? How much should they have known? What did it mean to have served honorably in the military of a criminal regime? American camp authorities initiated re-education programs, attempting to prepare prisoners for return to Germany by exposing them to democratic values and anti-Nazi materials. The programs were uneven in effect. True believers resisted, viewing them as propaganda. Others engaged cynically, playing along to earn privileges. But some prisoners genuinely wrestled with the ideas, comparing American ideals with their direct observations of American society. The disconnect between ideals and reality existed. America had racial segregation, economic inequality, political corruption. But the system included mechanisms for addressing these problems. The press could criticize the government. Courts could restrain executive power. Citizens could organize for change. These mechanisms were not perfect, but they existed and functioned, however imperfectly. Richter found himself particularly struck by American newspapers. In the camp library, prisoners had access to various publications, and Richter read them obsessively, trying to understand how American democracy actually functioned. The newspapers criticized military decisions, questioned political leaders, debated policy openly. This would have been impossible in Germany, where press was controlled and criticism was treason. The American papers revealed a society arguing with itself constantly, factions disagreeing vehemently, interest groups competing for influence. It seemed chaotic and inefficient. But somehow the chaos produced decisions, the disagreement generated policies, the competition created innovations. The system channeled conflict into productive outcomes rather than suppressing conflict through force. He tried to explain this to other prisoners during discussions. They argue about everything, he said. The newspapers attack the president. Unions strike against corporations. States defy federal government. Citizens protest policies. It should create paralysis, but instead it creates stability. Because the arguing is how they make decisions. Conflict is built into the system rather than being seen as threat to the system. That's why it doesn't break under pressure. The pressure is constant and normal. One prisoner, a former SS officer who maintained Nazi ideology, dismissed this contemptuously. It's weakness. A proper state requires unity, discipline, hierarchy. The Americans are divided and will collapse when real pressure is applied. Richter shook his head. We applied real pressure for 4 years. They didn't collapse. They multiplied their production, mobilized their economy, fought simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific, and supplied 6 allies while maintaining civilian prosperity. That's not weakness. That's strength we didn't understand because it doesn't fit our model of how strength works. The release process began in 1946. German POWs were repatriated in waves, returned to a devastated homeland now occupied and divided among Allied powers. Richter waited his turn, uncertain what he would find, knowing his home city had been heavily bombed, not knowing if his family had survived. The wait itself was surreal, living in relative comfort in America while Germany endured occupation and starvation. American newspapers reported on conditions in occupied Germany, the ruined cities, the displaced populations, the food shortages. The contrast with his current situation was sharp and bitter. When his turn came in August 1946, Richter was processed out of the camp, given documentation and civilian clothes, and transported to a port for embarkation. The ship would take him to Bremen, where he would be further processed and released. Standing on the deck as the ship pulled away from the American coast, Richter experienced a strange regret. He was returning to his homeland, to whatever family survived, to the work of reconstruction, but he was leaving behind the impossible country, the system that should not work but did, the abundance that had seemed unreal but was genuine. Return to Germany was brutal. Bremen was rubble, the infrastructure destroyed, the population barely surviving. His family had lost everything, his parents dead in bombing raids, his sister displaced to the British zone, his childhood home a crater. He found work as a translator for the American occupation forces, his English and his American experience suddenly valuable in ways his military service was not. The work brought him into daily contact with American personnel, and he watched them attempt to rebuild Germany according to their principles: democratic governance, market economy, individual rights. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, epitomized American approach to peace. Rather than extracting reparations and imposing punitive terms, America poured billions into European reconstruction, including aid to West Germany. The generosity was strategic, preventing communism, creating markets, establishing stability, but it was also genuine, reflecting American belief that prosperity was better foundation for peace than punishment. Richter watched materials arrive, factories rebuilt, economy recover, and understood that America was applying to peacetime the same systematic abundance it had applied to war. The pattern was consistent. He worked for the occupation government for 4 years, translating documents, facilitating communication, watching American democracy clash with German traditions. The Americans were often frustrated by German bureaucracy, German formality, German hierarchy. The Germans were equally frustrated by American informality, American impatience, American disregard for established procedures. But the systems gradually accommodated each other, producing hybrid institutions that combined American democratic ideals with German organizational efficiency. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, was this hybrid, a system designed by Germans but shaped by American influence and oversight. In 1953, Richter was interviewed by a German historian researching POW experiences. The interview, conducted in Richter's small apartment in Munich, lasted several hours and ranged across his entire war experience. The historian was particularly interested in Richter's perspective on American society, his observations about abundance and system efficiency, his evolution from believing Nazi propaganda to recognizing American strength. Near the end of the interview, the historian asked what single thing had most changed Richter's understanding of the war and its outcome. Richter thought carefully before answering. "The food," he said finally. "That sounds trivial, but the food in the POW camps was the clearest evidence that everything we'd been taught was wrong. Not just that. America was wealthy. We knew that intellectually. But that America was wealthy enough to feed its enemies generously while fighting a global war. That the abundance was so vast that sharing cost nothing. That waste was possible because production exceeded need by such margins. Every meal was proof that we had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American power. We thought abundance made them soft, but abundance was their weapon. They could afford to be generous, to follow laws, to treat prisoners humanely, because they operated with such surplus that these things cost nothing relative to total capacity." He paused, lighting a cigarette. American still, Lucky Strikes purchased from the PX. But it wasn't just material abundance, it was system abundance. They had surplus capacity in their institutions, their legal structures, their organizational methods. When something broke, the system routed around it. When challenges emerged, the structure adapted. There was redundancy, flexibility, resilience built into everything. We built our system around efficiency through discipline, eliminating redundancy, enforcing uniformity. When something broke, everything dependent on it broke too. When challenges emerged, the rigidity prevented adaptation. We were optimized for perfect conditions. They were robust across varied conditions. Robust beats optimized when conditions are uncertain. The historian pressed him on another point. Did Richter feel responsible for the crimes of the Nazi regime? How did he reconcile his service with the Holocaust and other atrocities? These questions haunted an entire generation of Germans, and Richter's answer was halting, uncomfortable. "I didn't know. Then I knew some things, but didn't understand the scale. Then I couldn't deny it anymore. I served the military, not the party. I followed orders. These are explanations, not justifications. I participated in a system of evil, even if I personally did nothing directly criminal. That stain doesn't wash away. The lesson I took was that systems matter more than intentions. I had good intentions, serving my country, protecting Germany. But I served a system that turned those intentions toward evil purposes. The Americans had better systems. Not better people necessarily, but better structures that channeled human effort toward less destructive ends. That's not moral absolution. It's recognition that morality alone is insufficient without institutions that embody moral principles." The interview concluded, and Richter returned to his quiet life, working as an English teacher, raising 2 children who would grow up in democratic Germany, never speaking publicly about his wartime experiences. He followed the Cold War with grim recognition of patterns, the Soviet Union repeating German mistakes, building rigid hierarchies, emphasizing will over systems, mobilizing ideological commitment rather than material satisfaction. America continued applying its formula of systematic abundance, containing Soviet expansion through economic rather than primarily military competition. When the Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991, Richter was unsurprised. The pattern had repeated. Rigid systems optimized for control proved less resilient than flexible systems tolerating chaos. Klaus Richter died in 1994, survived by his children and 4 grandchildren. Among his possessions, his family found journals from his POW experience, pages filled with observations about American society, attempts to understand systems that contradicted everything he'd been taught. One entry, dated July 4, 1945, American Independence Day, which the guards had celebrated with extra rations and a small ceremony, captured his evolving understanding with particular clarity. Today the Americans celebrated their independence with fireworks, speeches, and excessive amounts of food. The prisoners were given ice cream, a luxury I have not tasted since before the war. I watched the guards celebrate their national mythology, the rebellion against tyranny, the establishment of democracy, the creation of a government based on consent rather than coercion. It seems naive, this belief in abstract principles like freedom and equality, when the reality is so much more complex. But the ice cream was real. The abundance was real. The system that could produce ice cream for prisoners while fighting a war was real. Perhaps the naive belief in principles is what makes the abundance possible. Perhaps societies that treat principles as real eventually make them real through institutions and systems. Perhaps Germany's sophistication, our understanding that power matters more than principles, our cynicism about democracy and rights, perhaps all that sophistication made us weak. We were too sophisticated to believe in the very things that would have made us strong. They were naive enough to believe, and the believing made them powerful. That's the most unreal thing of all, that the naive believers defeated the sophisticated realist through mechanisms the realist couldn't imagine. The journals were donated to the German War Archive in Freiburg, where they reside among thousands of similar testimonies from German soldiers who survived the war and tried to make sense of their experiences. Richter's account is notable for its clarity, its systematic analysis of why German expectations about American weakness proved catastrophically wrong, and its recognition that systems matter as much as intentions or ideology. Historians occasionally reference the journals when examining German perceptions of American power, or when studying how individual soldiers reconciled service to an evil regime with personal morality. The story of Klaus Richter represents a thread in the vast tapestry of transformation that defined post-war Germany's evolution from totalitarian state to democratic society. Millions of Germans experienced similar psychological journeys, confronting the gap between Nazi propaganda and observable reality, grappling with guilt and responsibility, attempting to rebuild lives in a nation that had been morally and physically destroyed. The transformation was not simple or complete. Many former Nazis maintained their beliefs privately. German society never fully confronted its crimes. The democratic system remained fragile for decades. But the transformation was real, shaped by occupation, economic assistance, institutional reform, and the direct experience of democratic systems functioning. The abundance that Richter found so unreal in American POW camps was not accidental or temporary. It was the product of economic and political systems that generated sustained growth, innovation, and productivity. The United States in 1945 possessed approximately 50% of global industrial capacity, having expanded production massively during the war while other industrial nations were being destroyed. But the abundance predated the war and survived it, rooted in factors that included vast natural resources, large population, continental market, political stability, secure borders, and institutions that channeled individual effort toward productive ends. These advantages were enhanced by democratic systems that, however imperfectly, created feedback loops between performance and power, allowing unsuccessful policies to be changed and unsuccessful leaders to be replaced without revolution. The contrast with totalitarian systems was instructive. Nazi Germany achieved temporary efficiencies through forced coordination, but sacrificed resilience and adaptability. When central planning proved inadequate, the system could not adjust because adjustment would admit error, and admitting error threatened the leadership's legitimacy. When resources proved insufficient, the system extracted more brutally from conquered territories, creating resistance and instability. When military strategy failed, the system blamed insufficient will rather than flawed assumptions. The rigidity that enabled initial successes ultimately guaranteed defeat. The Soviet Union followed a similar trajectory, achieving impressive industrial mobilization but at terrible human cost, creating military power through systematic oppression, competing with American abundance through extraction and sacrifice. The competition was ultimately unsustainable, because the Soviet system required constant coercion, while the American system operated through incentive alignment. When Gorbachev attempted reforms in the 1980s, the system proved unable to adapt without collapsing entirely. The pattern held, rigid hierarchies optimized for control proved less durable than flexible systems tolerating messiness. The food that served as symbol for Richter, the abundant meals in POW camps, the casual waste, the ice cream on July 4th, represented something more than calories or nutrition. It represented system capacity so vast that generosity toward enemies cost nothing. It represented institutional commitment to principles even when inconvenient. It represented the strength of societies that could afford to treat law as binding rather than merely instrumental. That strength was not softness. It was the hardest kind of power, the power of systems that function predictably, creating trust, enabling coordination, generating sustained output across time. This is what Klaus Richter learned in interrogation rooms in Massachusetts and camp barracks, and years working for the American occupation, that his entire framework for understanding power had been wrong. That will was not superior to systems, that ideology could not overcome institutions, that abundance was not weakness but overwhelming strength, that treating people well was not sentimentality but practical strategy for maintaining loyalty and productivity, that following laws even when inconvenient was not naivety but foundation for stable societies, that chaos constrained by rules was more durable than order maintained by force. The lessons came wrapped in ordinary experiences, meals, interrogations, newspapers, conversations with guards, observations of casual waste and systematic efficiency. They accumulated slowly, each small observation chipping away at the edifice of belief until the structure collapsed and had to be rebuilt on different foundations. The process was painful, forcing confrontation with complicity, with wasted years serving evil, with the recognition that everything he had believed and sacrificed for was built on lies. But the process was also clarifying, revealing truths about power and systems and human organization that ideology had obscured. In the end, the most profound lesson was about freedom itself. Richter had been taught that freedom was weakness, that discipline required coercion, that order demanded hierarchy, that strength came from unity enforced by power. He learned instead that freedom was a system property, emerging from institutions that constrained power, protected rights, and channeled conflict into productive competition. Free societies were not weak because of their freedom. They were strong because freedom created incentives for effort, innovation, and loyalty that coercion could not match. The abundance was not despite freedom but because of it. The system efficiency was not despite chaos but because of mechanisms that turned chaos into information and decision. This understanding, learned through defeat and captivity and years of observation, became the foundation of post-war German democracy. Not all Germans learned it. Not all who learned it believed it. But enough learned and believed to support institutions that embodied these principles, to accept American guidance in rebuilding, to create a federal republic that rejected totalitarian temptations. The transformation was never complete. No transformation is. But it was real, measurable in prosperity, stability, and the absence of the aggressive militarism that had destroyed Europe twice in 30 years. Standing in that interrogation room in March 1945, Klaus Richter could not have foreseen these outcomes. What he saw was the immediate, the impossible abundance, the systematic generosity, the unreal reality of American power functioning with casual certainty. But he sensed the implications, understood that he was witnessing something fundamental about how societies organize power and resources. The cigarette Lieutenant Hoffmann offered, the chocolate in the mess hall, the casual waste of materials, these were not propaganda but evidence, proof that everything he'd been taught about American weakness was backwards, that strength took forms his training had not imagined. The interrogation continued for another hour, covering tactical details about Wehrmacht organization, strategic assessments of why Germany lost specific campaigns, observations about morale and ideology among German troops. But the real subject, the underlying theme throughout, was the clash of systems, one built on will and ideology and racial hierarchy, the other built on institutions and abundance and pragmatic compromise. One system had failed catastrophically. The other had prevailed with such decisive superiority that the outcome had never been in doubt once the full weight of American power engaged. When the session concluded, Hoffmann stood and extended his hand. Richter shook it, struck by the gesture's symbolism, equals parting after professional discussion, enemy to enemy but also human to human. In the Wehrmacht, such informality between ranks or between captor and prisoner would have been unthinkable. But American hierarchy was functional rather than sacred, maintained when useful but dissolved when purpose was served. Even this was strength, the strength of systems that adapted to context rather than demanding rigid adherence to form. Richter returned to the barracks, to the routine of camp life, to conversations with fellow prisoners about what they had seen and what it meant. The war in Europe would end in 2 months. His captivity would continue for another year before repatriation. The rest of his life would be spent rebuilding in the ruins of what he had served. But the understanding crystallized in that interrogation room would remain, a foundation for making sense of everything that followed. The defeat, the occupation, the reconstruction, the emergence of democratic Germany from totalitarian ashes. The lesson was simple but profound. Abundance defeats scarcity. Systems defeat will, institutions defeat ideology. The lesson was taught through ordinary things: food, cigarettes, newspapers, ice cream, because ordinary things reveal system capacity better than grand gestures. The lesson cost Germany everything: cities, lives, territory, sovereignty, the very identity of the nation. But from the rubble of that cost a different Germany emerged, one that had learned what Klaus Richter learned in American: captivity. That the future belongs not to those who believe most strongly, but to those who build systems that work regardless of belief, that generate abundance rather than managing scarcity, that treat freedom not as luxury, but as foundation for everything else. In a quiet archive in Freiburg, Klaus Richter's journals wait for researchers, testimony from a man who served evil and recognized it, who witnessed the defeat of his nation and understood why it was defeated, who spent years afterward trying to articulate lessons that a generation needed to learn. The leather-bound pages contain technical observations about American logistics, philosophical reflections on democracy and totalitarianism, personal struggles with guilt and responsibility, and throughout recurring amazement at the abundance, the impossible plenty that defeated armies through the simple expedient of having more of everything than anyone could imagine necessary. The most unreal thing, he wrote repeatedly, was that it was real. The abundance was genuine. The systems worked. The principles were embodied in functioning institutions. The naive belief in freedom and democracy and rule of law turned out to be hard power, harder than discipline or ideology or will. That reversal, sophistication defeated by apparent naivety, realism defeated by idealism, will defeated by institutions, was the lesson written in every POW camp meal, every newspaper criticism of government, every casual waste of materials, every ice cream cone served to prisoners on Independence Day. The lesson echoes still, relevant whenever rigid hierarchies face flexible systems, whenever ideology confronts institutional reality, whenever those who believe in power alone face those who have built structures that generate power through freedom rather than coercion. Klaus Richter learned it in captivity. Germany learned it through defeat. The lesson remains, waiting to be learned by each generation that mistakes order, imposed by force for strength, that confuses discipline with efficiency, that believes will can overcome systems. The lesson is patient, carved into history, proven through outcomes, simple as abundant food and complex as the institutional frameworks that generate abundance, unreal as systematic generosity and real as the defeat of those who thought generosity was weakness.